Okay, so now we're back. I hope the chavruta was good. I know some people got through more, some people got through less. As usual, that's just what the nature of the way this is going to work. We're going to get started now and go through. So anything you didn't get, not to worry, we will go through it. And by the end of class, hopefully everything will be clear. And as usual, there's a quiz. So you can take the quiz after class. Okay, so let's go through. Again, our Mishnah, just to be clear, because I know I was in one chavruta and it wasn't clear to them, the Mishnah is made up of 3 different takanot. Okay, the only one that we're dealing with today, there are 3 very separate takanot. The one we're dealing with today is ha'edim chotmim ala get mipnei tikun olam. And what you saw in the Gemara, that the Gemara right away asks the following question. Okay, we're going to go down now here to the Gemara. The Gemara is going to say, ha'edim chotmim ala get mipnei tikun olam. Okay, now I had you do it in the section, the quote from the verse, the quote from a Tanaitic source, and the words of the Gemara. I wanted you to see that the first part, this Gemara is just quoting the words from the Mishnah, which is very common. So the beginning is the Tanaitic source. Ha'edim chotmim ala get mipnei tikun olam. And now you have something weird because then the Gemara repeats the words mipnei tikun olam. Whenever that happens, you know that that's clearly something else because we don't say because of tikun olam, because of tikun olam. Right? It doesn't make any sense. So that must be the Gemara already starting a question and saying, what do you mean, mipnei tikun ha'olam? How could you say that witnesses sign on a document because of tikun ha'olam? Isn't that doraitahi? Isn't that by Torah law? Dichtiv, and this is a very strange thing. Instead of saying because it says in the Torah, which is what you would expect, it says dichtiv uchtov b'sefer v'chatom. Now you would have expected, right, that they would bring a verse from get, right? How do you know witnesses need to sign on the get? Because it says so in the Torah. But what does it say in the Torah? We already saw. It doesn't say in the Torah, v'chatam. It says v'katav. So what does the Gemara do? The Gemara takes a verse from Yirmiyahu, okay, which says, uchtov b'sefer v'chatom. Okay, if anyone didn't get this, I'll just show you briefly, which is, if you look here at the Gemara, so here, one second, okay. I'm not sure anymore how my share screen works if you're going to see it, so I'm going to open it separately. If you look at the Gemara, there's a number 1 here next to the words uktov b'sefer v'chatom, and that takes you to the Torah or. Okay, so the Torah or tells you that this is a verse in Yirmiyahu, where Yirmiyahu is basically telling the people, Sadot b'kesef yiknu, even though we're about to be going into exile, go buy fields. Uchtov b'sefer v'chatom, and go sign on the book, right? I said to one of the chavrutas, right? It's like telling someone in the Ukraine, go buy property now, right? It's a great time to go buy land, right? It's a terrible time. Why would anybody want to buy land now, right? It's a terrible place to be right now. But the point is, God says, Ki ashivit shvutam yom Hashem. I'm going to send you back there. And because I'm going to send you back there, I want you to have land, right? And I want you to have proof that you purchased the land. So write it in the book and sign on it. That's what they basically are told. Okay, so now going back to our Gemara, that basically proves that when you talk about writing something, there's no such thing as writing a document without it being signed. So therefore, this Gemara says, how could you say that signing a get is Tikun Olam when it's clear from the Torah that when it says write the get, it obviously means sign the get. And then again, why would the rabbis be instituting sign on a get when we already have a requirement to sign on the get? So the obvious answer is Rabba's answer, which is the Mishnah is simply following only Rabbi Elazar, who says you don't need signatures. Remember, he thought v'katav means write the get and then give it to her. And what witnesses do you need? We need witnesses to see the get being handed to the wife. So that's what Rabba says. Amar Rabba, lo tzricha le Rabbi Elazar. Lo tzricha is always a weird sounding phrase. What it means is it's necessary. Lo tzricha means, some people read it as lo tzricha, which is no, it's needed for this. But many people read it as a term that reads as lo tzricha, meaning it's not needed other than for Rabbi Elazar. Okay, meaning it doesn't match Rabbi Meir's opinion. It's only according to Rabbi Elazar. De'amar ede mesira karte, because he says, as we know, you need the witnesses that are passing it on. And therefore, Tikun Rabbanan Eidei Chatima Mipnei Tikun Olam. The rabbis instituted Eidei Chatima because of Tikun Olam. For what reason? Now we finally get to what's the whole point of this takana. For what reason is it? Well, Zimnin de Maite Sade, sometimes the witnesses die. Inami Zimnin de Azay Lemedina Hayam. You could have two situations where a woman wants to go get married. And in order to get married, you have to show you have a divorce document, right? Because people knew she was married. So she comes and she says, well, I'm divorced. And she shows them a document which has no signatures on it, which means she could have made it on her own, right? She could have photoshopped in whatever, right? Nowadays, it's much easier to forge documents. But let's just assume, right? She brings this document, no signatures. So they say, well, bring the witnesses that saw you get divorced. So she goes to find the witnesses. Either they're dead or they went abroad and you can't find them. So the woman's going to get stuck. Again, we're worried, right? Just like the last time. We don't want a woman to get stuck in a situation where she's stuck now and she can't get remarried because she can't prove her get. So Rabbi says that even according to Rabbi Elazar, who said, Eidei Mesira Karte, well, you're also going to need signatures on the get on a rabbinic level. So remember the way this works. There's Torah level. The Torah requires only witnesses that witness the get being given. But the rabbi said that's not enough, because what if those witnesses are nowhere to be found? We want to have something written, something that's proven. So he says, we're going to, right? So according to Rabbi Elazar, the Mishnah is saying you have to have signatures also. Okay? And that's Rabbi Elazar. And that's how we read the Mishnah according to him. And here, sorry, there was a mistake in the translation. This really meant Dilma Maite Eide. Maite is not bring, because Maite means two things. Maite could mean to bring, and that's why we accidentally translate it as to bring, but it really means maybe they'll die. The Eide Mesira will die, and the husband will claim, maybe the husband wants to torment her. And he says, what are you talking about? I never divorced you. So the real concern is that either she wants to go to court and get married, she wants to go not to court, but she wants to get married and she doesn't have proof, or her husband wants to claim I never really divorced you and you're really still married to me. Okay. So that's our concern. And that's why we have this Tikun Olam of witnesses signing. And that's all reading this Mishnah according to Rabbi Elazar. And then you have to deal with one issue, which is how does he grapple with the pasuk of Yirmiyahu, which says, Tov b'sefer v'chatom, and it seems so clear to the Gemara that was a Torah law, even though it's not really said in the Torah, but it was the way they reread katav by get must mean Tov b'sefer v'chatom. Anytime you write, you're going to sign. So Rashi says here that Haikra etzah tova kamash malan. He reads that pasuk just as good advice, okay? Right? Like anyone will tell you, I'm sure you've heard this line, get it in writing, right? Anytime you want to do something, get it in writing. Don't trust that you don't have to have everything in writing, but it will definitely serve you better. So it doesn't mean it's by Torah law that everything that's written has to be signed. It's just good advice in Yirmiyahu. He's suggesting to them, this is what you should do, but it's not that you have to do it, okay? So that's how he explains the verse in Yirmiyahu. Comes Rav Yosef, okay? And if you want to look forward for a minute, here's our review, okay? So here's the chart. Rabbah says the takana in the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Elazar. What was in the get before the takana? There were no signatures. What did the takana change? Witnesses need to sign. And what was the reason in Yirmiyahu that they had to sign their documents? Just good advice, okay? That's Rabbah. But comes Rav Yosef, and this is very typical. Where Rav Yosef, not just Rav Yosef, but in general, in the Gemara, this is typical. It's always introduced with an afilu tema. Afilu tema means, I know you think that the Mishnah works very simply according to one opinion, but I'm going to explain to you, even you can say, okay, that's the words literally, even you can say, Rabbi Meir, Hitzkinu she'edim efarshim shmotehem, etc. Okay, we'll get to the details. But afilu tema means I'm going to explain the Mishnah even according to Rabbi Meir. Even though you think the simple reading, and that's how we read it in the beginning, seems very clear, the Mishnah doesn't work with Rabbi Meir. Why doesn't the Mishnah work with Rabbi Meir? Because Rabbi Meir says on a Torah level, witnesses need to sign on the get. So if it's meant from a Torah level, there's no Tikun Olam of the rabbis coming and saying, oh, Eidim need to sign. Why would the rabbi say Eidim need to sign if Eidim already need to sign? That's not a Tikun Olam. So comes Rav Yosef and he says, no, I'm going to explain. How so? Hitkinu shehu edim mefarshim shmotehem begitin mipnei tikun olam. And now he's going to bring a kiddetanya. Kiddetanya is always, I'm going to prove it from a braita. Okay? So let's learn the braita first, and then we'll go and explain. Barishona. Okay, Barishona, this is like last week. Initially, this is the way things used to work. Hayakotev, and you might find this very fascinating. It's very hard for us to understand this, but they would write, Ani ploni chatamti ed. If you were signing on a get document, you would write, I so-and-so. Okay, you wouldn't say your name. You write, I am signing aid. You write aid, the word witness, okay? I'm signing as a witness. Okay, and then the next person would write, I'm signing as a witness, and that would be the end of it. Okay, now, how would that help? Right, you'd say, what kind of craziness is that? Well, im ktav yado yotzei mimakom acher kasher. If your signature was noticeable, right, your handwriting, there's people who analyze handwriting all the time. I had a unique handwriting. We'd check the archives of the court, and the court knew my signature from somewhere else. Now, this sounds ridiculous. If you live in a place like New York, this would be crazy, right? But if you live in a little small town where there's not a lot of people in town, and there's not a lot of people who function as witnesses, and the witnesses, there's the typical witnesses who always go as witnesses for all sorts of things. So then, you could say, the signature, it's very clear. Yes, you signed on this document, you signed on this document. And then when they bring the get to court and they say, well, did someone Photoshop in these signatures or is it legit? So they look, Photoshop would actually help because you can make it look exactly, right? But they didn't have Photoshop in those days. So if, they see the signature and they recognize it and they know it's someone who's reliable, who there's other documents registered with that person's handwriting, then they know that it was fine, vim lav. And if they couldn't, pasul, it didn't really work very well. So now this isn't a great system because, right, you can all see why it's not a great system. If I sign as a witness and nobody recognizes my handwriting, well, this poor woman is going to be stuck and her get is not going to be valid. She won't be able to get remarried. Her husband could still claim they're married when they're really not. So, Amar Rabban Gamliel, takana gdola hitkinu. By the way, it's not clear it's Rabban Gamliel, I want to point out. The Mishnah had listed someone before, the takana before was Rabban Gamliel. And then it says in Eidim Chotmim ala get mipnei Tikun Olam. It's not clear that it's Rabban Gamliel who instituted this or not, but this reading, right, this Rav Yosef thinks it is, or this Braita actually thinks it is. Amar Rabban Gamliel takana gdola hitkinu shiu mefarshim shmotehem begitim mipnei Tikun Olam. So comes another, now let's go here, let's go to our chart and let's see. So Rav Yosef says, the takana in the Mishnah is according to Rabbi Meir. What was in the get before the takana? Just the words, I'm signing as a witness. Once the takana changed, it was to say that witnesses need to sign their names. We'll get to the symbol part in a minute. And what was the reason Yirmiyahu would everybody sign their documents? Because by Torah law, all documents need to be signed. Okay? So now, here, by the way, I wanted you to see that the Masoret Hashas tells you where this Braita is from. And it's actually a little bit wrong that I'm calling it a Braita. And I'll show you why. Because if you look in the Masoret Hashas, okay, again, I'm going to show you. This is just important because it's important to know how to maneuver the daf. So right before the words Ditanya, here, Kiddetanya, and then right before we start this Braita, Barishona, there's a little hey there. Now, when you have the word Kiddetanya, that means we're starting a different Tanaitic source that's not a Mishnah. If it was a Mishnah, we'd say Ditnan. So if it's a Mishnah, there's always going to be a little letter here, and that's going to take you to the top of the page, the Masoret Hashas. And if it's a Mishnah, it's going to tell you where you can find that Mishnah. In our case, it's not a Mishnah. So there's not necessarily going to be a source because it could be, it's a Braita, which is something that never made it into the Gemara, into the Mishnah. It didn't make it into a book called the Tosefta, which is parallel to the Mishnah. And maybe this is the only occurrence of it in all of the Gemara. So it's possible you won't have a reference here. But sometimes it's a Braita that's mentioned in other Gemaras, or it's a Mishnah that's mentioned in other places, or it's a Tosefta. So in this case, if you look, it's the letter Hey. The letter Hey appears here, if you can see where my cursor is. And it tells you it's Tosefta Samach Pei Zayin. What is Samach Pei Zayin? Sof Perek Zayin. Okay, a lot of what they do is Sof or beginning or that. That's how they spoke, right? He's telling you it's in the end of the 7th chapter of the Tosefta. Again, the Tosefta is a book that's parallel to the Mishnah, written from the same time period. So this happens not to be a Braita in our case, happens to be a Tosefta. Okay, that's just a side point. It's not critical to what we're learning, but it is interesting to understand where these sources come from and what they are. So now the Gemara continues. So the first thing I brought here is the Tosefta Kipshuta, which is Professor Saul Lieberman from not so long ago he lived. And he writes here, okay, he used history, and this is why I want to talk about some methodology that we're using today. One is to use history to understand this. And what he says here is in the ancient world, I'll read it in English, most people were illiterate. Okay, this is my translation. It's not the official translation. It was written in Hebrew, but I'm reading it in English here. Most people were illiterate, especially in the villages, and a signature was the equivalent of a stamp in our times. For the most part, they knew who the witness was or the witnesses, and it was possible to validate their signatures from another place. Because of this, we're going to see, and this is the Gemara, that they also allowed symbols from famous rabbis, even if their names didn't appear, and even if it wasn't kosher writing, okay, whatever that means. But the point is that this whole thing, which seems so strange to us, is really an outgrowth of this idea that people weren't literate. And that's why people wouldn't necessarily sign their names, because people couldn't even necessarily read the signatures. Okay, or maybe people didn't even have their own signatures because they weren't literate. Okay, and now the Gemara is going to continue and say, wait a minute. Bisiman alo. Okay, now they're asking, wait, they didn't do it with a siman. Okay, wait a minute. We said everyone signed, I am a witness, and that was it. So he says, what do you mean? Didn't they sign with symbols or pictures? And now we're going to have a whole list of, I think it's 5 rabbis. Okay, we'll count as we go through. V'harav tzier kura. He drew a fish. Rabbi Chanina tzier charuta. Okay, some of these I gave you the definitions. Some of them Rashi just translates it, which I wanted to give you in Rashi because I wanted you to see that sometimes Rashi doesn't actually act as a dictionary, but sometimes when there's strange words that don't appear often in the Gemara, so Rashi tells you what the definitions are. So here, for example, charuta, he says it's the branch of a tree, anaf shel dekel. Okay. Rav Chisda, samach. He used the letter samach. Rav Hoshaya, ayin, which could be either an I he drew, or maybe the letter ayin. Rabba Bar Huna tzier makuta. Okay, makuta, Rashi tells you, is the sail of a boat. That was his insignia. So here you have all these rabbis. So Rav Chanina, Rav Chisda, Rav Hoshaya, Rav Bar Huna. I was right, it was 5 of them that each used symbols. So what do you mean people wrote aid? What about symbols? People drew these pictures. And then, right, they were people's pictures. So they say, well, Shane Rabbanan, debiki'in simanayu me'ikara. Debiki'in simanayu. The rabbis are different. Now, again, I'm teaching you how to punctuate. So when you get to the word Shane, Shane means shoneh. It's different. And it's almost always coming as an answer to a question. So when you know that, you know there was a question before, and you know that we're now getting the answer. So the answer is the rabbis were different. Debiki'in simanayu. Their simanim, in other words, didn't. Now, we have an issue here. The Tikun Olam was you have to sign, if we're assuming, what's the Gemara's question here? The Gemara's question, sorry, I didn't explain it well. The Gemara said before that according to, right, this is Rav Yosef. According to Rav Yosef, let's actually look at the chart. Rabbi Meir says, before the takana, I'm signing as a witness. After the takana, they need to sign their names in full, right? Rav needs to sign Rav, whatever his last name was, or, Rav Ben someone, even though he's always called Rav. But, right, all these people need to sign their full names. So how could these rabbis not be signing their full names? They use symbols, pictures, instead of signing their full names. So the Gemara answers, wait, these rabbis were different. Why were they different? Dibiki'in simanayu. Because they were known for their signs. Everybody knew that Rav used a fish. And everybody knew that Rabbi Chanina drew a palm tree. It was known. These were famous rabbis. Their signatures were known entities. So it was basically equivalent to writing your name. Okay? And that's why even after the takana, these rabbis weren't writing their names. Now you might say it's a bad example, right? They're setting a bad example. Why are the rabbis not writing their full names if that's really what's supposed to happen? But okay, you can assume they were somehow different and it was okay. Then the Gemara asked the obvious question, which we always ask in these kind of things. Well, how did they get known for their names, for their symbols? At some point, they had to have started their symbol. And how did everybody know the first time that Rav goes by a fish? And how did they allow that document, right? How is that document valid if it didn't have a valid signature and nobody knew at the time that Rav was a fish? It was his first document. So the Gemara answers B'diski. Okay, Rashi explains what is B'diski. Shtarei shelot u'tshuvot u'shlamot. Well, he was known because he wrote letters to his friends and he wrote questions and answers to people and he always signed his name at the bottom. So his first simanim that he drew were on documents that didn't need validating or anything like that. Okay, it was only later, once he was known by his symbol for that, that he was then able to use the symbol on formal official documents. Okay, so what I want to, before we move on to the extra stuff, I want to just go through what we did in this sugya and a few methodologies, and then we'll finish with a little bit extra. So the first thing to note is that we talked about this last week, and I quoted this in the name of Rabbi Chana Dreyfus, who talks about that there's shkafim, there's transparencies, which is taking a sugya and connecting it with another sugya and kind of overlapping the sugyot and showing how they work together. And we did the same thing this week. We took a sugya of ha'edim chotmim al haget mipnei Tikun Olam, and what we did was we wanted to view it together with Rabbi Elazar and Rabbi Meir. And the question is, how is it viewed, right? And how is this takana? Okay, what's interesting about this case, is that in the end, the takana is really for the same reason. The purpose of this takana is to ensure that the woman has a way to prove that her get is valid, okay? Either which way, right? Either we're worried the witnesses are going to die, the ones who saw the Masira, that's according to Rabbi Elazar, or we're worried that the witnesses are not being clear about, right, that we won't be able to validate their signatures, so we're going to change it. The big difference between the two of them is that according to Rabbi Elazar, was a major change. It was saying instead of the main thing being Eidei Masira, now we really need Eidei Chatima. According to Rabbi Meir, it was Eidei Chatima, it's still Eidei Chatima, it's just a little variation of it. It's how they signed, and we're changing how they signed it. So it's a much more minimalist approach. And this, I wanted to talk about this because this is something we've seen with all the takanot, that when we had different interpretations, some thought, the rabbis had power to change a lot of things. And others thought, no, the rabbis have, they have some maneuvering power. They can change something, but not so much. So according to Rabbi Elazar, we're really changing the Torah law, right? The Torah law is Eidei Masira. The rabbis are saying, well, we really need signatures, okay? Now, the big question in the Rif and the Tosfot, and this is really what I wanted to, and the other thing, by the way, methodologically that we did was we used some historical information, like from Saul Lieberman, to help us understand better, some part of the sugya that wasn't so critical. But what I want to show you here in the Rif and the Tosfot is there's two different approaches to Rabbi Elazar, because if we take Rabbi Elazar at face value, it sounds like he's saying, by Torah law, you need Eidei Masira. The rabbis came and changed it and said you need Eidei Chatima. So what, you don't need Eidei Masira anymore? Again, this goes back to the question we always keep asking, which is the rabbis are uprooting something from the Torah. Is that possible, right? Are they saying we no longer need witnesses? And especially if we go back to the beginning where I said that many people view Eidei Masira as that makes the get happen. Without that, there is no get, right? Just like Kiddushin. If you don't have Eidei Kiddushin, you can claim the marriage never happened, even though it did. But the Eidim actually function as making sure that it affects the divorce. So affect it within, right? It makes the get actually work. Without it, it's not. So how can you change and say instead of Eidei Masira, now all we need are signatures, right? And so it's very hard to understand. So the Rif and the Tosfot each have different interpretations. And what I want to show you here is very interesting. Okay, maybe I'm not sure if we should read it inside now because we're short on time. Maybe I'll just show you in the chart, okay, that I charted it out. Basically, the Rif is known, even though the words don't appear in the Rif this way, people quote him as this, as saying, Af Eidei Masira Karte. When he says Eidei Masira, he doesn't mean you have to have Eidei Masira. He means that before the takana, you could either have Eidei Masira or Eidei Chatima. which would mean that we're going to explain Rabbi Elazar totally differently than we thought. The role of the witnesses, according to this, is just to prove that the divorce took place and not to actually affect the divorce. Okay, you follow the difference? He thinks that before the takana, it could be either or. After the takana, you have to have witnesses who sign, okay? And who saw the get be given. You really need both, okay? The takana was, you have to insist there's both. So in which case, we're not changing anything major according to this. We're not saying instead of Eidei Mesira, we now need Eidei Chatima. We're saying before you needed either or, now you need both. Why do you need both? Very simply, to give the woman more options, right? Because then she could either find the Eidei Mesira, or she has signatures on the get itself, right? In case they die, in case that. It's basically to give the women more options. So that's a unique understanding of Rabbi Elazar that's very different from how we understood Rabbi Elazar to begin with. Tosfot really has a different approach. And Tosfot says, no. Before the takana, you needed witnesses to see the get being given. No Eidei Chatima. After the takana, witnesses who sign and who saw the get being given. You can't give up. And this is why, okay, Rabbeinu Tam says, this is Rabbeinu Tam within Tosfot. He says, it's not that we're changing things, right? Neither of these opinions, I want you to know, think that you don't need Eidei Mesira anymore, right? You need both, okay? The first opinion, the Rif was saying you need both just so that we cover our bases. And we now can, right, let the woman prove it in any way she can. But Tosfot says something fascinating. He says, no. It's not either or. In the beginning, really, Rabbi Elazar only needed Eidei Mesira. And really, they're the ones who affect the divorce. And you have to have Eidei Mesira. So what's the takana then? Right? The whole takana is you need Eidei Chatima in case those witnesses were to die. So he says, well, the purpose of the takana is in case the witnesses can't be found. And then what, right? Let's say your Eidei Mesira disappear, they die. So what happens? Now we bring the Eidei Chatima, we look at the get, we see, oh, there's good signatures, we're good. But comes Tosfot and he says that won't help you because you still need to know that there were Eidei Mesira. So he says these fascinating words. I'm going to show you them inside. It's very famous, okay? Demistama behechsher nase. He says if that woman provides a get with signatures, we can assume that witnesses wouldn't have signed on the get if it weren't passed on in front of kosher witnesses. And he says, the fact that now we can't find these witnesses that witnessed the event, if we have signatures signed on the get, it proves that there must have been witnesses that witnessed the get actually happening. Okay? Why is this fascinating? Because what he's saying is, even after the Tikun Olam, you still need Eidei Mesira. And what's what we call the nafkamina between them? According to him, if you knew for a fact that no witnesses witnessed this divorce, it would not be valid even with witnesses signing. Whereas the Rif in the end says it's really you need one or the other. Okay, so as long as you have one, it's fine. According to Rabbeinu Tam, this law didn't uproot the Torah law. You still need Eidei Mesira. The change was, well, we need Eidei Chatima because maybe we'll never find those witnesses. Maybe they'll die. Maybe they'll go abroad and we won't have it. So we'll have witnesses, but those witnesses are only really there to validate the fact that it must be that it was given by kosher in front of kosher witnesses. And that's because according to him, without those kosher witnesses watching this event happen, the get is not a get, just like the marriage is not a marriage. And then, so there's two very different approaches about how to understand Rabbi Elazar, and both of them are different from what we originally thought. So I wanted to show you here that there's a lot of depth to understanding what exactly is going on. And again, I think each of them are weighing how much of a difference can the rabbis change things? How much can they change and veer from what basic Torah law said? And that's what I want to end with, which is why I love teaching these sugiyot, because they're so fascinating in terms of what power do the rabbis have, right? It's one of the basic issues in all of Torah Shebaal Peh. How much power do the rabbis have to change something that says in the Torah, right? Or to change, right? Again, what is something that says in the Torah? We saw today, something that says in the Torah, it's not necessarily said in the Torah, it's all interpretation anyway, right? But we assume there's something by Torah law, which again, in this case, we don't really know what the Torah law was. There's a difference of opinion about it. And how can the rabbis change that? And depending on what you thought it was, the Torah law is what the Tikun Olam is, and we saw different variations as to how big a change this Tikun Olam actually was. And we saw it really in all the Sugiyot that we learned in this section. And with that, we'll finish our class for tonight.